Hey everybody, welcome to the Leek. I'm John as always, and it's time for another post-mortem of a draft format. Last set for Guilds of Ravnica. I hated this set. I think it was one of the worst of all times, and so a lot of people asked me, why? Why did I hate it? And so I actually went one above, and instead of just tweeting out it was bad because of X reason, I made a post-mortem video. I broke down the format and kind of all the flaws I had with it. I talked about some other good stuff. I talked about my favorite art and stuff like that, but the point was to break down the format from a sort of critical perspective. And I don't want to just do that for sets that I hate. I want to do that for all the sets. And coincidentally, here we are with Ravnica Alllegiance, a set that I love. So Ravnica Alllegiance was much better than Guilds of Ravnica. Guilds of Ravnica I rate in my bottom 5, at least bottom 10 of all-time formats. Ravnica Alllegiance probably definitely in my top 10. I haven't exactly quantified them just yet. So what happened with Ravnica Alllegiance to make it so much better? Well, like with Guilds of Ravnica, where I talked about the mechanics and how poorly balanced the mechanics were, let's take a look at Ravnica Allegiance's mechanics. Up first was Addendum, which was kind of the only whiff of the set, and even then it was sort of a whiff, and not that bad. It wasn't terribly impactful, as it didn't have that much choice associated with it. Typically, you always knew when you wanted to cast it, whether you were going to cast it as a sorcery or as an instant. Summary Judgment deals 5 damage if it's a sorcery, 3 if it's an instant. If you're killing an X3, use it as an instant. If you're killing an X5, you use it as a sorcery. There was no real choice associated with most of the cards. And so that was really sort of the only whiff on Addendum, but it was still fine. It wasn't random like Undergrowth was, for example. Spectacle, the Rakdos mechanic, had a chance to whiff because it's a mechanic that requires setup. Something has to be done in order for the mechanic to even be online. Luckily, life loss is something that just always happens in a game of Magic, and especially happens if you're playing a red-black deck like Rakdos happens to be. It was really easy to turn Spectacle on, so much so that for the entire format, I explained how I didn't really care about Spectacle enablers. I didn't want to really play a Spear Spewer because I was going to have Spectacle online. And I only ever had to have Spectacle online once per card, with a couple of rare exceptions. And of course, if you throw in things like Ill-Gotten Inheritance, which are good and happen to enable Spectacle, it just wasn't that big of a setup. Additionally, another potential whiff for Spectacle was if the cards were so wildly bad without Spectacle. Let's imagine Blade Juggler was a 7-drop. You would never want to play that. But Blade Juggler was totally fine as a 5-drop and really good as a 3-drop. Skewer the Critics, totally fine as a 3-drop, great as a 1-drop. So everything was sort of costed really well, at least the playable ones. There were, of course, a couple Spectacle cards that were just bad, like Spike Wheel Acrobat and Rafter Demon, but in general, the Spectacle cards were solid without Spectacle and better with, which is a great way to design a mechanic. Riot required absolutely no setup whatsoever. You cast the creature, you get the Riot. And unlike Addendum, there were actually some choices with Riot. Very frequently I found myself looking at the board, casting that creature and going, should it have haste? Should it have +1/+1? And it was sometimes a hard decision where you had to think about, can I get that damage in right now, and is that better than potentially getting more damage in later? Very nice to have a mechanic that has actual choice, game to game, cards where you might play it one way one game and play it differently another game. So Riot, another solid mechanic. Afterlife was another no setup, no nonsense mechanic. You play the creature. If that creature dies before you win or lose the game, you get another creature, a relevant flyer at that. Luckily, this mechanic was dialed back slightly. When we started getting spoilers, I started going, uh-oh, what happens when we see all of these Afterlife 5s and Afterlife 6s? Luckily, there was a single Afterlife 3, and it was bad. Afterlife was really Afterlife 2 and Afterlife 1, and there wasn't even that much Afterlife 2. So I think dialing it back really saved this mechanic and just made it a totally good mechanic, as opposed to sort of an overpowering format warping mechanic. Again, another good mechanic, no real setup required for it. Through the course of the game, the mechanic will happen. Finally, Adapt, the Simic mechanic, is the star mechanic of this set, and is a mechanic that I think raises the set up to another level, a level of a good draft format. Already totally okay creatures with Adapt, later in the game can continue to be relevant threats. Mechanics like this do tend to trend a format towards being a good format because it helps lessen the effect of Flood by having a place to sink your mana later in the game. If you're flooding out, oh no, you got your 6th land and you're playing a relatively low curve deck, surprise, you can turn your Soroform hybrid into a 6/6 if you had nothing else to do with the mana, and that's a great way of designing a set, having something to do with your mana, because Flood will happen. And you don't want to punish the players too heavily for Flood happening. Having a place to pump that mana is a great design decision. Additionally, Adapt really helps your creatures not be bad top decks late in the game. Soroform Hybrid as a 2/2 for 2 would suck on turn 10, picking it off the top of your deck. You pick it up and you go, oh, this isn't relevant in any way, shape, or form. But if you pay 8 mana for it, either right away or over the course of a couple of turns, it's a 6/6. It's going to jump into the fray and be relevant. So being cards that have a way for you to pay your mana late in the game when you're flooding, be a way to make a creature that was relevant in the early game still be relevant off the top of the deck in the late game, really, really good. Adapt was such a good mechanic. I'd like to see it come back, and I think it actually could come back, just slightly reflavored. It could still be Adapt, it just wouldn't be Simic creatures mutating. It would be, heroes adapting to tribulations or something, and therefore getting some counters. Great mechanic, and I think was one of the big things that stepped this format up to being a very good format. Moving on to the decks and the guilds that made up this format, unlike Guilds of Ravnica, all the guilds were viable here. Guilds of Ravnica, Selesnya was awful. You were going to lose almost always if you drafted Selesnya. Golgari, similarly, rather bad unless you were the only Golgari drafter at the table, and you lucked out. But in Ravnica Alllegiance, all the guilds were solid. Rakdos was the worst guild in that you might not always be able to win the draft, but you still could absolutely win the draft with Rakdos decks with some regularity. It was the worst, but by percentage points, not by, entire tiers. In addition, multiple decks existed per guilds, which was great. Rakdos could be Rakdos aggro, 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop. You could play Cavalcade of Calamity if you wanted, and a bunch of Goblin Gatherings. You could go hard aggro removal, play 5-drop removal spells into Captive Audience, and win on turn 11. Azorius, of course, was a star of this in that you could play blue-white Flyers, you could play blue-white High Alert, blue-white Dovin's Acuity, blue-white Control, all within one guild, and they all used different cards. That's a great way of doing a Ravnica set. With Guilds of Ravnica, I said I was happy to see Ravnica blow up, the guilds die forever, because that level of restriction tended to make really bad draft formats. They actually showed here that it's not necessarily the case. As long as you make multiple decks per guilds and make sure that those decks don't 100% share their cards, then I think you can have a much better format, because everybody at the table can get a deck. You don't have people getting stuck into an unplayable guild or getting stuck with, a third of a playable deck and a whole bunch of garbage. In addition, the Gates deck was very, very good in this format. The Gates deck in Guilds of Ravnica people liked because it was a little bit different than the Guilds decks, but you were basically playing the Glaive of the Guild Pact, and that was about it. Whereas here we had very good gate payoffs for that gate deck, and not only that, those gate payoffs could be played in regular non-gate decks as long as you had just a few gates. So just a ton of playables in this format, a ton of playable archetypes and decks, and that's huge towards making a good format. Now, RNA isn't all roses and rainbows and gumdrops. There's some problems with it, with the biggest problem, of course, being the enchantment removal. People cited very early that there was a very small amount of enchantment hate, specifically at common only having exposed to daylight in white, which was weird. Typically, we had enchantment hate in white and green. What's interesting is the magnitude of enchantment removal isn't that different. I took a look, and a lot of sets, when there weren't artifact or enchantment synergies in the set, had 2 pieces of enchantment hate. Typically, Disenchant, Naturalize was the common combo pair, 1 in white, 1 in green. Here we had 1 instead of 2. Turns out that's still a huge change in the format, because you had it all locked into one single color as opposed to being available in 2 colors, which is actually like 7 decks or something. I made that number up, that you could actually play or splash that in. Moving up to uncommon, we had Mortify, which again was in white, It was also in black, but it was also white. The green enchantment hate was at rare, and they weren't good. Rampage of the Clans was awful. Cindervines was fine out of the sideboard, I guess. And, just having them at rare made you feel really bad about opening them in packs as well. So the enchantment removal combined with the lack of enchantment removal, combined with there being some really big, powerful enchantments like Ethereal Absolution, to a lesser extent Rhythm of the Wild and Ill-Gotten Inheritance, those are beatable enchantments. Your opponent can easily just not follow those up properly. I talked about this a lot, how I think Rhythm of the Wild, 50% of the time, you just beat it because your opponent didn't follow it up with a mass of creatures. But of course, there were times where you really wanted that exposed to daylight. So enchantment removal, definitely one of the real knocks against this set. Doesn't knock it too far down from being a fantastic set, but it is a very real problem. So the last thing we'll talk about today before we get into the Sunset Show quick questions is MTGO and paper versus Arena. A common complaint, a common rant that I have in my videos. Arena still fell way behind in this format. The bots were updated one single time this time around. With Guilds of Ravnica, we had at least 2 or 3 updates, and the bots were still real dumb. Real dumb. Pre-update, the bots refused to pick gates or gate payoffs, and as a result, the gate deck was always opened and almost always correct for you to pick. After the update, the bots started picking gates a little bit higher, but still failed to pick the payoffs. You could still wheel Gatewatch Colossuses, Gatekeeper Colossuses, whatever those Colossi were, Gatebreaker Rams and Blaze of the Gates, Gates Ablaze or whatever, still were easily pick-upable. In paper, online, it just didn't happen that often because those payoffs were playable, as I mentioned, as long as you had a few gates. If I had 3 or 4 gates, I'd probably play the Colossus. I'd definitely play the Ram in a green deck. But the bots just not taking them meant that the gate deck was still very much there. In addition, the Dovin's Acuity Clear the Mind decks, which I never actually got around to playing, relied heavily on cards that the bots weren't drafting. Things like Prying Eye, Sphinx's Insight, Dovin's Acuity, Clear the Mind. The bots weren't drafting them, and therefore this deck, which worked, it was a weird deck and obviously could be raced, but it worked so easily and it was so easy to draft because the bots didn't know. The bots didn't understand. The bots didn't self-correct. This deck simply didn't appear in paper or MTGO very often because there weren't really enough cards to make that deck if anybody else was even slightly trying for it, or sometimes even if somebody else was in blue-white. They'll take your Sphinx's Insights or whatever. They'll take your Dovin's Acuity for a bit of value as opposed to being the meme Dovin's Acuity deck. So once again, Magic Arena simply falling way behind MTGO and paper when it comes to the limited experience. I've said this before, it's a fun experience. I in fact love streaming it because I can look past the problems if I'm hanging out with chat and hanging out with the community. But as a draft experience, it's a definite step down from MTGO and paper. We really need to get human drafts going in Arena, and I don't know if that's actually going to ever happen. So to wrap up this post-mortem, let's do the quick questions segment, which is heavily modeled after the limited resources Sunset shows and the Sunset posts that used to be done on the limited resources community. I haven't seen one for this set yet. Anyways, we're going to go over a bunch of quick questions, quick best, worst, etc. that I'll give a quick answer for.
Best archetype.
So I think Simic was the best. Adapt as a mana sink was just such a huge advantage. If I was going into a draft, Simic was definitely where I wanted to be. Just things like Sauroform Hybrid and Skittering Eel, Mr. Skitters, were just great value. They were good in the early game, good in the late game. Simic, my favorite archetype.
Worst archetype.
Rakdos aggro, but again, it could still win. It just relied a little bit too much usually on having a consistent fast start. And if you didn't have that, if you had 3 drops in your hand instead of 2 drops, well, you often just failed.
The rare I always wanted to open.
Ethereal Absolution. Obviously, not much contest here outside of maybe Biogenic Ooze, but Ethereal Absolution, absolutely the rare that I always wanted to open.
The fun rare I always wanted to open.
Theater of Horrors. Having 2 hands in a red-black aggro deck is just serious gas. There's so much card choice. Again, you enable Spectacle constantly. It enables it itself if you pay 4 mana. Theater of Horrors was just such a fun card, and I did not get to play with it enough. I think I only played it twice.
The card that got away.
I don't think I ever cast a Spawn of Mayhem or even drafted one. I opened one on a Crack-a-Pack, and I think that's about as close as I ever got to playing that card. Really wanted to play it just because it's ridiculously cheap.
What card surprised me?
Ill-Gotten Inheritance. I thought this was awful. It didn't affect the board and wouldn't be playable, I said. I think I gave it an F. I was wrong.
The most overrated card.
Ill-Gotten Inheritance. Yes, it was playable and even good in some decks, but there was a good period of time where people were first picking this. They were splashing for it. They were splashing for multiple copies of it. And it's just not that good. It can be raced. It can be beat relatively easily. If it's your win condition and your opponent exposes to daylight it, you're toast. Ill-Gotten Inheritance definitely overrated.
The most underrated card.
Spire Mangler. I saw this passed a lot. I saw people talk it down a bit, but I always love X1 black flyers. Give me a 3/1 black flyer for 4 and I'll love it to death. And letting this thing ambush something upwards of 4 toughness or even help another flyer of yours ambush something was just serious value. I loved Spire Mangler. I think it was picked too late, too often.
The biggest groan test.
Ethereal Absolution. The lack of enchantment hate outside of white and this just absolutely taking over the game was a lot to handle. Nothing felt worse than seeing this on the other side of the battlefield.
The most frustrating bad card to lose to.
Mirror March. Just Mirror March. Mirror March and a bunch of coin flips. Luckily, I only lost to this once, but it did involve 6 successful coin flips on my opponent's part. I tried to make it happen once. I played a draft with this and it never happened. So that's going to wrap it up for the Post-Mortem. Like I said, I absolutely love Ravnica Alllegiance. I will come back to this set. If it's on flashback somewhere, I will draft it. Draft it. It's so good. It's definitely entering my top 10 draft formats of all time. I don't think it's going to squeak into top 5 just because I include things like Unstable and Cube and Masters sets in there. But top 10 for sure. This has been a fantastic set. I'm a little sad to see it go away. We're going to have to see what War of the Spark has to do. But let me know what you thought of the format. Let me know your answers to those quick questions. Let me know quick questions that you want to see in the future, etc. In the comments down below. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can find me over on Twitch, Facebook, Twitter. You can find me at patreon.com/themanaleak if you want to help the channel out financially. You can go to inksgaming.com, use the promo code manaleak10, all one word, 10 is the number, to get 10% off your order and to help out the channel. If you like the content, click that thumbs up button, click subscribe if you want to see more. Stick around, we're going to try to do a lot more long form content like this, more top 10 lists, more breakdowns of stuff, just to try to get away from just being a pure gameplay channel. So if you have ideas, things you definitely want to see, let me know that as well. But otherwise, see y'all next time.